Now we move on to our panel discussion. This will be chaired by Sarah Davidson, Chief Executive at Carnegie UK, an organisation which seeks to improve the lives and well-being of people across the UK and Ireland through influencing public policy and practice. Joined also by Dr. Jim McCormick, Chief Executive of the Robertson Trust, an independent grant-making charity in Scotland. He joined the Trust in October 2020, so not too long ago. Previously, he was the Associate Director for Scotland for the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, ran an independent research consultancy and was the Director of the Scottish Council Foundation think tank. Also joined by Satwat Rehman, Chief Executive of One Parent Family Scotland, a trustee at WEAll Scotland, so one of my lovely bosses, and a member of the Just Transition Commission and the First Minister's Advisory Council for Women and Girls. And lastly, Fraser McKinlay. Fraser is the Chief Executive of the Promise Scotland. Prior to that, he spent 16 years working for Audit Scotland, including 10 years as a Controller of Audit and Director of Performance Audit, and Best Value responsible for performance audit across public services in Scotland. That is a mouthful, Fraser. We need to simplify your bio. But that gives you a flavour of the people that we've got on this panel. I think it will lead on really nicely from Fiona Duncan's speech just there. So without further ado, over to you, Sarah, and panel.
Good morning, everyone. Is that working? It sounds like I can hear a bit of an echo. Great, thank you so much. And thank you to Jimmy for the welcome. I was pleased to just get here in time to catch Catherine. Anyone else who was travelling along the M8 this morning would know that unstoppable momentum was not a feature of the experience. So I am delighted to have a few moments to gather my breath before chairing this panel session. And thank you, Fiona, so much for those reflections on the promise. For me, it was a really good reminder at the start of today that the kind of change that we're talking about is not the kind of change that comes about because we just sit around and will it, or wish it, or hold hands and try really hard to bring it about. But actually, it's the result of multiple, deliberate, aligned changes to decisions that people take and what people do every single day. Fiona was kind enough to make a reference to Carnegie UK just towards the end of her remarks there, and obliquely to our mission to improve well-being. Those of you here who are familiar with our newish strategy that we published last year will know that we define well-being as everyone having what they need to live well now and in the future. So that slide that Fiona put up at the end there with everyone on it is something that really resonates for us. And this, what we at Carnegie call collective well-being, is a vision that goes beyond economic considerations and comes about when economic, social, environmental and democratic outcomes are equally valued. But a bit like with the promise and its delivery plan, in this iteration of our strategy, we've gone a bit further than we had done in the past and recognised that willing and wishing well-being, collective well-being, was not enough, and instead recognised that you need to do some things quite deliberately, quite consistently, in order to bring it about. And we described those things in our strategy and we called them the well-being tests. And essentially these are the conditions and practices that need to be in place for well-being to be realised. In other words, collective well-being won't happen by accident. I had the privilege of getting a pre-read of Fiona's remarks yesterday, and what struck me more than anything, well, perhaps apart from the sheer will and commitment that it takes to keep on advocating for what she believes in so strongly, were the multiple resonances with the well-being tests. So I brought them with me today. Here they are. And I'm just going to give you a couple of moments to read through those, and I hope that you can see the resonances as well with so much that Fiona was talking about. I'm sorry that the number of them means they can't be a bit bigger on the screen, but if you want to look at these, they're on the Carnegie UK website. And I haven't got time to go into any of them in detail, but I would encourage members of the panel in their comments to maybe think about whether there are resonances there for them as well, and indeed when we come to the floor to invite you to share your own reactions to them. So that's me had my chair's privilege. I'm now going to invite the members of the panel, each in turn, to introduce themselves and to take a bit of time to give you their reactions to what we heard from Fiona, from the distinctive perspectives that they have and the work that they do. We'll then have a bit of discussion among ourselves, and then we'll come to those of you in the room. So please, as you're listening, do have a think about the questions that you'd like to ask or the comments that you'd like to make on what you've heard so far. And I'm going to begin by turning to my left to Jim McCormick at the end here, Chief Executive of the Robertson Trust and a good friend of ours at Carnegie UK, to ask you to start. And I will pass you the microphone, literally.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone, Jimmy, colleagues, for the invitation to be here today. The remit to follow Fiona Duncan is not one you take up lightly. We'll do our very best to follow on from what we've heard. And Jimmy, I didn't spot the invitation to add to the playlist, but you've got me thinking. So my suggestion for the playlist would be Grace Jones' Slave to the Rhythm. As an example of what we should stop being slaves to the rhythm. If you think about what we've been through long before COVID, an economy that locks in poverty and inequality, that drives existential climate change, that does the opposite of advancing equality. We need to find ways in all of our systems at every single level, deploying all of our resources to stop being slaves to those rhythms and to make sure we are embedding into our systems social, economic, and environmental justice. But just a couple of thoughts on, from our perspective as an independent grant maker in Scotland, what some of the anchor points might be in where we go next. First of all, the heart of this for me is about being really, really clear and ruthless about our purpose. And in our case, our purpose is to build solutions to poverty and trauma in Scotland in this decade. We're adding, 2 years on from our strategy launch, something that was underplayed. We want to do that in ways which reduce carbon intensity and risk, and which actively advance equalities. And the day after Equal Pay Day and the week after Living Wage Week, there's a lot we can do if we, even just by focusing on economic justice. Next point, set the tone. I think it really matters how we speak about all these issues. We of course have to get past the holding pattern or the spin cycle that Fiona talked about, but how we speak, the metaphors we use, the language we use, the solutions we frame, all set the tone for either paralysis or decisive action. At the Robertson Trust, we are proud to host the Each and Every Child programme. My colleagues are in the room today. That is directly related to the challenges Fiona was talking about. It's there to reframe how we think and act about care for children, young people, and the role of families therein in our country. And it does, I think it picks up the challenge that Fiona laid down to us, which is we have to stop analysing and admiring, perversely admiring the problem and the depth of the problem, and consistently frame for solutions. Because many of them are before us already. This is not trying to invent something we haven't envisaged. We have so many of the resources, ideas, and the motivation to act, to build solutions, to send out signals in the noise. We are absolutely living through a time of polycrisis, and that lands upon the kind of families we're talking about today. But, it's a really important but, there are solutions all around us. We just need to ensure they are no longer like water through sand, here today, gone tomorrow. We have to build in resources, we have to shift ownership of assets and decision making to make these solutions robust and scalable and effectively create a new system. How can independent funders help to do this? Well, one thing we're doing, and it's not enough, but we've decided in this 3-year period, we're going to earmark 25% of all of our charitable expenditure for upstream investment. My colleague Russell Gunson would call it big change that lasts, starting with financial security as a frame for this, because the Carnegie Wellbeing Test about tackling poverty, unless we are attending to people's everyday needs, we're going to struggle to move on to more advanced needs. And so 25% that we will challenge ourselves not to put into crisis responding. We're doing that too, but we have to begin to put down the roots and build longer term change that will last. Can I give an example, Sarah, of how I think we've been able to support partners doing this brilliantly already, and it's very relevant to the agenda of the promise. 3 years ago, so before I arrived, I take no credit for this, one of our 3 social bridging finance investments was with Children First in East Renfrewshire, which we all probably know to be a relatively affluent part of Scotland, but it has pockets of disadvantage and trauma, and they're not always in the places you expect. And taking only a geographic lens to disadvantage and social change is going to hold us back. We have to get much better at identifying families wherever they are, whoever they are, in order to make this work for everyone. And this initiative, which is a family wellbeing service, is focused on something very, very resonant coming out of the last 2 years. And I should say, with COVID, which has generated so much hardship and heartache, we are far from out of it if you are disabled and shielding or a carer, and we would do well to remember how we frame that debate. But in this case, it was focused upon adolescent mental ill health, before, during and after the last 2 years. If you're lucky, you might get put onto a CAMHS waiting list when you present with those kind of needs. As we heard from Fiona, that isn't always the case. But if you're lucky, you might. But those waiting lists we know are very, very long. And even if you didn't need a CAMHS intervention on day one, after 9 months, 12 months, 15 months of waiting, you probably do. You're waiting, you're getting sicker, your family's getting more stressed, you're not going to school. An unstoppable momentum in the wrong direction. Shifting that vicious cycle into one that's virtuous, we know a lot about how to do that. And in this case, it was a set of conversations with GPs, fundamentally, as the front line in primary care, to give them confidence that there are alternatives that are cheaper and more effective than clinical interventions, which are sometimes the right thing, but not always. And this is a whole family, whole community way of holding those hardships and heartaches, understanding what's driving them, addressing unresolved trauma, and enabling young people to get back to live their lives and build the friendships and thrive in the way that we all want. It works, it's cheaper. The big challenges are about commissioning. We're not there yet, but we do have an NHS that has been willing to pick up and fund for the next 2 years. So it's a bit of progress, and that tells us that if we can have funding, brilliant social sector partners at the front line, and ways of working with the statutory sector, and it is bloody hard, but people are there to do a good job, and there are lots of barriers that get in the way. And when there are solutions, when there are alternatives to the heart-sink responses that we are stuck with currently, you can see the energy, you can see the light back in people's lives, you can see the relief at the front line for primary care and social work. And we need to get better at those kind of ideas through all of the challenges that we face. Really briefly, final point would be mobilising all forms of capital around solutions, not just financial, but my goodness, financial matters. And on that point, we absolutely have to reshape our tax systems. Stop taxing good things like people's labour to the extent that we do. Find ways to reward and support unpaid labour, and then shift our tax system to wealth and property and landholding and carbon. So that's one point we can do on taxes, but way beyond taxation, we need to find ways, I think, of mobilising private wealth holding as well, to find ways to bring in pension funds, to bring in private sector investors who are absolutely potential allies around better solutions. They know the system they have worked in is busted. They know it's failing, and there's a lot we can do if we are clever and we make invitations and we understand where motivations can meet in common ground. But it's not just about the money, it's about human, social, intellectual, moral, and environmental capital. Aligning those is entirely feasible. I think we've all got a responsibility to get on and show and demonstrate how we can prioritise those ways of mobilising all forms of capital in the here and now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. And let's just keep going down the line. Satwat, over to you.
Thank you. And following on from Jim's suggestion for what should be on the playlist, I think mine would be Rip It Up and Start Again by Orange Juice. Those of you old enough to remember Orange Juice, that is. There has been so much in what we've heard so far this morning which resonates, that the difficulty for me is trying to see how I can distill it into something that sounds halfway coherent. Because when Fiona was speaking, I was going, yes, 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 that makes sense, that makes sense. How do we transfer that across here? Who do we need to get around the table to do that? And I went immediately into problem-solving mode. But you know, that's fine. But I was trying to think about how I would solve these problems within the realms of my expertise and experience. But what it actually needs is to think about how we draw in all the expertise and experience. Otherwise, the solution I'd be coming up with would be one that suits me and doesn't suit everyone. And I think that's one of the critical things we need to be thinking about, is broadening out the movement that we have in this hall amongst our allies, and seeing how we engage in conversations with those we don't feel comfortable talking to. Yeah? I wouldn't feel comfortable or would find it very difficult to have this conversation with someone who was sat there with extreme wealth. But I need to learn to get over that so that we can have those conversations. Because for me, building on something Catherine said about the economy nesting in and not sitting above us and the planet, but that's something that, you know, ecological and feminist economists have been saying for a long time. Well, how do we start to bring those voices to the centre from the edges? Many of us have been involved around the edges of things and feel at times it's very difficult to get into it. But what we need to make sure is that this movement remains open and we don't fall foul of that ourselves. What happened with the care review and the culmination of the promise, to me, is almost like a model of what we can look at. Do you know, there was a problem. It was seen as an intractable problem in many ways by those involved in the myriad of systems that Fiona spoke about. There's a campaign, a movement, which listened to those who mattered and worked with those who mattered, as opposed to having the same people in the room trying to fix the system that they were part of. And that's culminated in the promise and a commitment. and Fiona and her team and the Oversight Board and others who are there to hold us to that commitment and that promise, because it's one that we're all responsible in making happen and making the change happen. So those are some of the ways that we need to be looking at how we're bringing that learning into the work that we're doing here in the wellbeing economy. Because, as was also said, the economy affects us all. But I think what we have, and what Jim spoke about so eloquently, was that at the moment we have an economy that's based on failure demand. You know, we have systems that are failing people, and we put money into propping up those systems and trying to fix things and not prevent those things from happening. And ultimately, the wellbeing economy is about shifting to that prevention. But in so doing, not hardwiring in the inequalities that we currently have in the system, and at the same time being very cognizant of not building in new inequalities that we hadn't considered. And through the work that we're doing in the Just Transition Commission, that's key. That's at the heart of what we want to do. Because otherwise we could have a transition from fossil fuels to green forms of energy, low carbon forms of energy, which would maintain the structures and the status quo that currently exists. But there's nothing just about that. You know, justice, and it is justice here that I feel strongly that we're striving at. Justice is about addressing those things, is about tackling, ending inequality, ending poverty, and making sure that the systems, because there are always going to be systems that we're developing, have that as the aim, and not something which perpetuates or exacerbates inequalities because it serves the few as opposed to the many. And I have a quote here too. I had a couple of quotes, but I'll just do the one. And it's a quote from Jimmy Reed from his Alienation, or I think it's more commonly known as the Rat Race speech in 1972 here at the University of Glasgow. And I think this is key. The untapped resources of the North Sea are nothing compared to the untapped resources of our people. I am convinced that the great mass of our people go through life without even a glimmer of what they could have contributed to their fellow human beings. This is a personal tragedy, but it's also a social crime. And I think that's at the heart of what we need to fix. It's about people, it's about planet, and it's about how we can ensure that we are tackling inequality, injustice, and poverty through a well-being economy approach. That's not about profit. That's not about concentrating wealth in the hands of the few. Because actually, we're all connected, do you know? Inequality is bad for everyone. It's absolutely shit, excuse my language, for those who are at the hard edge of it, but it is bad for everyone. And so it's going back to that and working out what matters to us that we need to measure, and not doing what we're currently doing, measuring what's easy. And I'll stop there, but thank you.
Thank you so much. And now, last but not least, with his own microphone, Fraser.
Hello, is it on? Yes. So it's very tempting at this point just to say everything that they said, I agree with, but I should probably offer some of my own thoughts. And also, thank you, colleagues, for the pressure of now having to come up with a song, having done that. So I'm going to go with I Can See Clearly Now, which I think was Jimmy Cliff, probably, a number of versions. And the reason I say that is that one of the things I'm kind of fascinated about, and I've been in this job as Chief Executive of the Promise Scotland for 2.5 months. It is much easier to say Jimmy as a job title, so that's a good thing, than my previous one, which was absurdly long. But I did spend 15 years in Audit Scotland writing about stuff like this, as Sarah knows, because Sarah was in government for large chunks of that time. And it is really interesting that I think the case has been made. Like, I don't think we need to be talking about whether a well-being economy is a good idea or not, and yet it isn't happening. So the thing I'm really interested in is why not? Why is it so hard? And as you do when you come to events like this, you reflect on some stuff, you go back and read some things, and the Christie Commission's already been mentioned. The other one I would add to that list is the brilliant work that colleagues at Carnegie did 10 years ago around the enabling state, the original discussion paper written by Sir John Elvidge, which I read again last night. It was actually November 2012, so 10 years ago. Brilliant piece of work. And it's another one of those reports that you think, see, if we'd just done that, then that would be fine. And we probably wouldn't be having this conversation now. So I'm interested then in what are the things that get in the way, and I'll come back to that in a second. Our job in the Promise Scotland as an organisation of about 25 people, so quite small, is really to ensure that the care review, the recommendations, the actions of the care review are implemented, that the promise is kept by 2030. Kind of like Jimmy mentioned earlier on, the Promise Scotland will cease to exist by then. We don't want to become part of the system. So our objective is to be not around in about 7.5 years' time, by which time we will be keeping the promise. And our job as a small organisation really is to influence, to lead, to cajole, to nudge, to occasionally knock heads together, and increasingly importantly, I think, and this takes me to my second point, is to talk about the how. We've mentioned already today, there's been a lot written this last couple of years, I guess, about the implementation gap. Increasingly, I think it's because people really struggle to know how to do stuff. Now, that's not to say that people aren't doing brilliant stuff across the country, because they are, but what we're not very good at is taking that learning and applying it across the piece systemically. And that's not just about saying you can just pick something up there and drop it over there, but it is about a much more systematic approach. Sarah's point earlier on. So that's, I think, going to be a focus for us in our work, is being maybe a bit more assertive around saying this is really what good looks like in practice, not just in terms of the vision, but in terms of actually what you should be doing. And if you're not doing those things, you need to explain why not, because we have evidence that it works. So I think we might be taking a slightly more kind of assertive tone on some of that stuff in the next wee while. The other thing I would say, Jimmy, colleagues, is that our purpose is the same. As Fiona said in her contribution, by the way, boss, excellent speech. Well done, just to say. I thought I'd better get that in. The wellbeing economy makes keeping the promise easier, and therefore we are on the same page. We will absolutely do everything we can to support the development and creation of a wellbeing economy in the same way that I know you're very committed to helping us keep the promise, Jimmy and colleagues. So absolutely side by side on that front. But I guess my final couple of observations come back to that first point about why is it not happening, Sarah. And we hear a lot about systems change and the need for systems to change. And my experience of reporting on, writing around the use of public money and systems change and public service reform over a decade and more is that people are really comfortable with systems change as long as it's not their system that's changing. We're dead happy for that system over there to change, but actually I'm not the problem. And that is true across the piece. That's statutory sector, public sector, private sector, third sector. Everyone else feels that their system's okay. If everyone else just did what I think they should do, it would work fine. Actually, systems change has to be everyone's system. That'd be my first observation. The second thing, Fiona mentioned this already, I absolutely understand how difficult the financial situation is at the moment, particularly in public sector terms, but as a result of that, particularly for the third sector and communities. But in terms of public sector money, I'd make no apology for continuing to be very challenging when people say to me, we don't have any money. We spend somewhere between 40 and 50 billion pounds a year in the public sector in Scotland. I went to a meeting about a year ago now, with apologies to any Scottish Government colleagues in the room, where it was a big bunch of directors, brilliant people by the way, genuinely wholly committed to doing good work. And I heard, well, we don't have any money to do that. And I said, because I'd done a wee back of the fag packet sum before I went into the meeting, I said, your collective budgets are £8 billion. Like, just in that room. We do have the money, we're choosing to spend it on the wrong things. Now, I equally know that's a dead easy thing for me to say. And the shifting of the money in the whole Family Wellbeing Fund is a classic example. The shifting of the money from the crisis intervention, from the acute end of the system into early help and support and prevention is really hard. But we've been talking about it for 20 years plus. And finally, and colleagues will forgive me for banging on about this. I genuinely believe that the vast majority of people working around public services in the broadest sense are absolutely committed to doing a good job every single day. They turn up to do good work, they believe in all the stuff they want to change, and yet they find it really difficult. So I'm really interested in our systems of accountability. What are people held to account for in their jobs day in, day out, and how do we incentivize people to make better choices and to do different things? Because they know it to be, it's just what Jim was saying, they know it to be right, and yet the way we work makes it incredibly difficult for people to make the right decisions. So there's something about our systems of accountability and incentives that we fundamentally have to look at and change. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So thanks very much to all of you, and just a reminder to the people in the room, I'm going to be coming to you very quickly for questions, so just start thinking what you would like to speak about before you get asked to put your hand up. But I'm going to actually just start where we finished. Fraser, you talked about people not knowing what to do, and I recognise quite a bit of that, and we've talked about that before, but I'm interested in how that connects to what Fiona was saying about the absence of an ingenuity gap. So if we accept that there are really good ideas and good understanding about how to do this, but it's just not landing in the right place, what do you think we might do to connect those, and to what extent is that actually what you and the Promise team are trying to do, and how could we share that understanding to help other people?
Yeah, so certainly in our world, which, you know, our job, I guess, is fundamentally twofold, which is to make the if somebody needs to be in care, to make that experience much better, and equally importantly, to prevent, you know, children and families having to get involved in the care system in the first place. So that's our focus, and one of our jobs very specifically is we call it joining the dots. So it's about actually ensuring that good practice in one place is spread, because that's why we're here. That's a job we can do, and don't get me wrong, it happens, but I think we need to do it more systematically. I think the other thing that gets in the way, Sarah, is that even when you identify the good practice, it's then applying it in your own context, and that is about giving people the space and the time and the resources to do it. And too often we expect people to squeeze this kind of improvement work into the corners of their day job. I'll give an example. I'm kind of borrowing one of Fiona's examples, but Fiona tells a story of somebody she knows who went to get access to their care records in a local authority, doesn't matter which one, and the experience was absolutely brilliant. Couldn't be better. Exactly as you'd want it to be, really sensitively done, all done kind of textbook stuff. There is no reason why that experience is not felt by every single person accessing care records across the country. That's not about money, that's not about, well, you know, it doesn't require resource, it requires a frame of mind, it requires an approach. There is no reason why that can't be replicated everywhere else. So I also think there is something, as I said, about being clear about what that good looks like in very specific practice terms. And then if people have a better idea, then that's great. But we should flip it a little bit rather than saying how, you know, let 1,000 flowers bloom. I do wonder sometimes if we need to be a little bit more assertive about what we think should be happening. And if people either don't agree with it or have a better plan, then that's okay. But let's start from that place rather than saying let's have an open conversation about how this might be done.
No, that's really helpful. One of the things that I've reflected quite a bit on, actually since leaving government, is the extent to which I think when you work, particularly in central government, although I'm sure it applies in some other statutory services as well, it's possible to feel a terrible burden of having to have the answers to every question. And it's really good to have opportunity to be reminded that actually you don't have to have the answer to every question, and that there are people out there leading the way with really good practice. And I wonder, Jim, I'm just interested maybe to invite you to unpack a little bit more what you see as the role of funders with a point of view in that perspective, because you're not just funding, you have got a vision as you described it. And how do you see this, what are the core skills that are needed to get these good ideas into statutory services and to land there?
Thanks. So yeah, on the stance you should take, it's a bit of a cliche, but I think it's true to describe what we do as, so we're independent but not neutral, and it's an important distinction. How can we be neutral about the missions we all have in this room? And I think those of us who have independence and resources have an absolute responsibility. Not to make our voices necessarily the louder ones, but absolutely to create platforms that enable our partners, who are the ones doing the hard work in serving the people and places we're here for them to feel they have got the platforms, the opportunities, the connections, the skills, the support to advocate for change. So I think it is a bit statutory sector, but not only. So here's why I say that. It's really palpable that I refuse to call it the third sector anymore, so I'm going to call it the social sector. Okay, so in this sector, which is often the first line of defence and sometimes the only line of defence in parts of Scotland, there are problems with co-option because of the funding relationship they often have with the statutory sector. That often means the hard conversations take place below the parapet, and we are not speaking truth to power in the way that is necessary. Respectful, constructive, but also robust. And I think what we're seeing now is in the recovery community, amongst disabled people, especially those who had the toughest time at the height of COVID, carers, the care experience community, we've passed a tipping point, I think, where people are no longer willing to be complicit in dysfunctional systems where if they're lucky, they get crumbs off the table in commissioning models. I think that anger has flipped into something constructive potentially, which is about how we capitalise new forms of activity with other revenue streams. Ideally not at odds with public policy, but very often leading public policy, and hopefully the statutory sector will catch up. But people have justified anger, and they are moving on to try and build something more hopeful. So that's going on. I think we have a role to understand that and to support it where it aligns with our mission and values as well. Not only statutory sector, because this has to be about employers, it has to be about business. One data point I looked up this morning because I wanted to double check it following Living Wage Week. So the good news from last week is Scotland has 90% of the workforce covered by the real living wage. It's the highest it's been since we started tracking it. It's the highest in the UK. But if you don't look at percentages, look at numbers, and you ask yourself, how many people in Scotland are in working households and still in poverty? Let me tell you the number. It's 370,000 people. That's the population of Aberdeen, Dundee and Stirling combined. People who are working and still poor in 2022 in the best performing part of the UK. We have to stop benchmarking with the rest of the UK. Look out to the rest of the world. Look to small countries like Denmark that have flexibility and security in their labour market, and understand what infrastructure between government, social sector, workers, and those who represent workers, what infrastructure is needed to get us to a well-being economy version of the jobs market that works for people who are currently working and poor.
Thank you. Jim, when you were talking there about the real living wage and the high percentage of people there are in Scotland in receipt of it, but yet we've still got these completely unacceptable levels of poverty. It's also about looking to see, as you said, about what else we need to do to address that issue. And so we've got living wage, but now there's campaigns around living hours, because the number of hours you're able to do on that living wage is going to have a significant impact on your income. And then you begin to see that affects eligibility for other things. And actually, if you then, I'm going to give an example of an individual who we worked with in One Parent Family Scotland, who then went on to get a job with us, providing peer support. And then she came to see us, and we'd worked out the 16 hours, living wage, etc., meeting the caring responsibilities that she had, because what's most important to her is her children. And that's what we were looking to see how we could support. But then she came and said, actually, I'm worse off. And we said, okay, let's look at it. How are you worse off if we give you more hours than the 16? Well, I'll lose eligibility for free school meals. I'll lose eligibility for school clothing grants. I'll lose eligibility for this. And she went through a whole list of things. And then you sit and you incorporate all that, and she's right. She would be worse off. So in a way, what we've got are systems working in silos. And as Fiona said, we're not looking at what some of the drastic consequences are on other systems, or the whole experience for the individual and the family, which is where we need to be starting. And coming back to some of the things that Fraser said when looking about the how, I think one of the issues we have is people are really risk averse, but without thinking about how risk-ridden the system that they're propping up is. And we need to be thinking about how we can shift that to say, actually, it's more risky to not do anything than it is to try something new. And we've created a culture that we need to address of that risk aversion. And from that comes the defending the system as it is, as opposed to looking to see what we need to do to improve the system and the experience. And what we need to do is create spaces where people feel safe to be able to open up and have those honest conversations as the start of that. You know, I'd love it if a group of civil servants came and said, you know what, I haven't got a clue what I'm doing, help. Yeah, great. Let's get some heads together and look to see what we can do. Do you know? But we need to create that in order for people to be safe to do so. So yes, we have the intent, we have the ingenuity, and we need to unpack what's behind the implementation gap to be able to address it.
So I'm going to ask you to hold on to the microphone because there was something else I wanted to follow up on which you said which really interested me, which is this question of how do you bring from the margins to the centre? And the journey that Catherine was describing in her presentation at the beginning was very much one of a movement that has made some steps towards the centre, but I'm sure many people in this room would recognise what you said about the feeling as though you're kind of shouting from the edges. And I wondered if you could just say a little bit about what you see as both the challenges but also the opportunities that people can grasp to step into the centre and how you might do that.
Well, the challenges, I think, is some of what you've already just said there in terms of how we can get to the centre. It's about breaking down some of that wariness and suspicion that we're going to come in there to batter them over the head. We're not, you know, because that's not going to get us anywhere. We want to be around that table to discuss and to shape what will actually make a difference. And I think if we look at, COP27, we've had 27 years of COP, and where are we really in terms of what we need to change? But if you look at the movements that come together in parallel with the official COPs, you're beginning to see an awful lot of innovation, connections being made, and, you know, huge, huge campaigning successes in a way, around loss and damage, for example, at COP27. You know, these are things that haven't just happened overnight. They've happened as a result of very small movements beginning and coming together and connecting with others. And that's what I think is so important about a day like today. Because, you know, we've got the promise here. We've got the wellbeing economy here. We've got some of us working with the third sector, some funders here, a range of people with different perspectives and different contributions that can be made, but also recognising that we always will have power imbalances within those situations. So actually, and I'm sorry to pick on you, Jim, but you're sat next to me, I would see it as Jim's responsibility in spaces where he's able to be raising some of these issues and seeing how the door can be opened to get some more dissenting voices in there. I see it as mine. I'm sat here today, but I'd prefer it much more if it was some of the parents we worked with who were sat here today. That's my responsibility, to centre them and their experiences. So there is something about how we create it within our professional, personal and campaigning lives and demonstrate and model what it is we're wanting to see from others. And there's nothing wrong with actually just keep banging on the door either, Do you know, that works eventually for some of us.
Thanks so much. I was really struck by what Fiona said about everybody having red lines. And Jim, you were alluding a moment ago to the red lines that some people in service provision are finding that they can't cross and are prepared to cross. And again, just reflecting on what you were just saying, but I wonder, it's interesting for us to reflect on how it is once we're in the doors that we choose to set down our red lines, and at what point do we turn up the volume on some of the things we have to say. And I think it's often been said that gatherings like this and people like we are quite good at being polite, and it's something that as an organisation we've been thinking a lot about in the last year, having adopted an organisational value about challenging. I mean, that one of our 4 values is to be challenging. We've recognised that that's not necessarily something that always comes easy, or maybe it comes easy when you write it down, but doesn't always come easy in conversation. And I'm wondering, Fraser, whether that connects also to your point about accountability. Because speaking as a funder, there's a question for us about, we don't have the same types of accountability that people held in public services do, so we're almost trying to create that accountability for ourselves. But you've worked closely for years with very hard public sector accountability, and yet public accountability that doesn't necessarily drive the outcomes that the people working in it want to. So I wonder if, just as a final point now before we come to the room, you'd like to say anything more about how you think accountability could be redrawn.
Thanks, Sarah. And I guess I would start by saying, in a sense, I'm in a very fortunate position because the care review and the promise that resulted from the care review has drawn the red lines, I think, for us. I mean, it's very clear about what shouldn't be happening and what must happen in its place in the future, and that's our absolute focus. But and actually, I completely recognise your thing, because obviously, having worked for Audit Scotland 15 years, I wasn't really allowed out much, or to say very much. So this is quite new territory for me personally to be able to. I was at my first ever party political conference, whenever that was, a month ago, which was interesting territory for me. So I completely recognise that, and I'm easing myself into that. In terms of the accountability piece, I do think genuinely it's about. Well, actually, in the end, I always, and if there's anyone from my health board, I apologise for picking on health boards, because I always pick on health boards when it comes to this question. But if you're the chief executive of a territorial health board in Scotland, you're not being held to account for the extent to which you're keeping the promise, day to day. Now, that's not to say they're not committed to it. Personally, I believe they are. But the thing, in the end, that gets the phone call from St Andrew's House from the CABSEX office is how your waiting times are doing, how your delayed discharges are doing, whether or not you were part of a meeting that discussed whether you were going to be charging for, but we'll not go there. That's another conversation for another day. So there's something for me about the day-to-day reality of people working in jobs, and I pick a senior leader type job in the public sector, but actually the same applies everywhere. If you're a social worker, if you're working for a community group, what are the things that in the end you know you're going to be held to account for, and what are the things that actually you know you're going to be rewarded for, however that reward manifests itself? And are we absolutely sure that we are measuring the right things? I don't think we are. I think, as Fiona said earlier on, too often we measure what's important to the system, not what's important to the people that we're delivering services for.
Thank you. Now I'm going to come to the room. I think we have some roving mics somewhere. Yes, we have people waving roving mics. So who would like to stick their hand up and ask the first question or their own observation? There's one up there at the back. We'll start there. The mic over there, please.
Hello, Ian Scott, Scale Deep Institute. Our focus, by the way, is wealth, health and happiness as opposed to health, wealth and happiness, because we think wealth is the route out of poverty and a number of other things. So 6 months ago, we followed up some work we'd been doing on obstacles that communities face as they try to make things happen. And we undertook research mapping the number of agencies, organisations and whatever delivering economic development in Scotland. And we thought it would be a short exercise. We've had to pause because it's been utterly overwhelming. The range, the duplication, the spread. As somebody said, what do these people do? Is it strategic generalities? Some people do some things. but we have no idea of the number of roadblocks, sleeping police persons, or anything else that's out there. And in fact, we're actually going to say, why don't we hand the file over to Audit Scotland? But I'm interested in the panel's response. What do we do with the proliferation of organisations that are actually getting in the way and not helping things happen? Do we close them down? Do we have a review of the review? Thoughts welcome, thanks.
Thanks very much. There was another question just nearby there. I'll take that as well, and I'll invite panel to. Oh, so yes, first there, and then down the gentleman just next to the speaker.
Okay. Will I just ask just now? Lovely, cool, thank you. So my name's Lynn Martin, I'm from V&A Dundee, Museum of Design, and everything that's been mentioned this morning in terms of getting people on the same page, hang on, I've taken some wee notes just to make sure I'm not rambling here. So the panel's been talking about breaking down silos, holding space with people that we disagree with, which is really important because we're in a lovely bubble today and we all feel really safe, but how do we conduct these conversations with people who we need to bring on side for the movement? Closing the ingenuity gap, so taking risks and prototyping, getting together behind ideals as a collective and taking dispersed risk because we're all in it together. Making safe spaces, bringing people from the fringes to the centre, unpacking the implementation gap. All of these things, design and design principles and the design mindset sits at the very heart of making these things work. And I was just wondering from the panel, how much have you taken design and design's role in the wellbeing economy into consideration?
Thank you. I will just take third one now, and then I'll invite the panel to pick those points up.
Thank you. I don't feel safe, and you'll probably know why when I tell you what my question is. We're in the home of Adam Smith. This is Wealth of Nations. This, some might see as a birthplace of capitalism. And we've done about 2 hours, and for me, we've not named the key issue which stands in the way of a well-being economy. To give a practical example, this week's Chancellor was saying that he wasn't taking an ideological view with not putting VAT on private education, which could have potentially raised 1.7 billion. He was taking a practical view. And for me, that is a context that we sit within. It is ideological to challenge the status quo, but the status quo is not seen as itself as deeply ideological. So for me, if we want to talk about the, the unstoppable momentum towards a well-being economy, we need to talk about post-capitalism. We need to talk about post-colonialism. We need to talk about, for me, a well-being economy does not have a monarchy. It does not have a military industrial complex which sells the weapons of death to oppress others. It does not have a House of Lords. It does not have this focus on looking at families in poverty and discussing how we set up systems when the very system that we are supporting is the ones that drives that inequality, because that is at the heart of capitalism. So for me, for this discussion to move forward, we need to be willing and demand that we start to imagine and prefigure a world past capitalism and a world that really engages with the natural world and is not at war with it. Thanks.
Thanks. Three really good questions. I'm going to ask Satwat to start by picking up where we finished there, and then maybe ask Fraser to say something both about design and about fragmentation, because I know that's very much at the heart of the Promise work.
Thank you very much for that question at the very end, and I must say I couldn't agree with you more. And actually, in the notes that I'd made for today, I did have the C word in there, capitalism, because I absolutely agree that ideology is at the heart of what we're talking about here, and inequality isn't an unintended consequence of capitalism, it's built into the system, you know. And I think that people sometimes think that when we're talking about the well-being economy, we're being soft, gentle and cuddly. Actually, we're not, do you know? Because absolutely at the heart of what we're wanting to do with the well-being economy is to address those systemic and ideological issues which result in the levels of inequality and poverty that we have seen, and the increasing wealth gap, the increasing levels of inequality that we're seeing. And it is about looking to see how we can reset that. And it's not about tinkering around the edges. I think that's the main point I want to make, that when we're talking about this at WEAll Scotland, or with the allies that we have and the networks that there are, it's looking at the levels and types of solutions that can happen which don't leave people feeling disempowered by the scale of what needs to be done. You know, so we have some very local community initiatives that are making a real difference. And it is that thing about think local, act global. When we're looking at the environment, there's a lot of that we're doing. But we're only one player in all this, and that's why partnerships and allegiances and alliances are so important to the work we're wanting to do. Because this is an ideology, and you spoke about post-colonialism, and I absolutely agree. I mean, you know, was also at the heart of capitalism, and the creation of the systems we've got was the exploitation of the resources and the peoples in the global south in particular for the benefit of the global north. What we now have in the climate crisis is those communities in the global south experiencing the worst of the effects of the climate crisis created by the emissions and the levels of continuing emissions from the global north. These divides are there on a number of levels, but within all that, we've seen wealth increase for those at the very top. We've seen multinationals like the energy companies having enormous profits at a time when most of the people who we work with, if not all of them, can't afford to turn their heating on. These are the inequalities that we're trying to address, and it's not going to be easy because fundamentally it is about shifting a much bigger macroeconomic system. But it's about looking to see, you know, for me what's important is that we try and we work together to try from a very local level up to the trying to shift the thinking around the economy and what's important at government level.
Thanks, Sarah. So to come to, I think it was Ian M's question about the plethora of organisations. Yeah, I share your pain, Ian. So Audit Scotland did actually do a piece of work a wee while ago around economic development, just at the point they were creating yet another economic development agency in the south of Scotland. And so what do we do about it? I mean, I think there needs to be much more rigour before new things are set up. I would say that. I think we need much more clarity about purpose, about what new organisations are going to be doing that isn't already being done, and also thinking about the opportunity cost, because those organisations that are being established to do a thing means that we're not spending money on something else. So we need to be really, really clear about, you know, if we think setting up a new organisation is the way to go, that it's actually going to make the difference. In terms of what we do about it now, I mean, I do think the government at the moment is in a place where they are going to have to look at getting rid of some organisations. I'm very mindful, though, that that's not an easy thing to do because people work there and they do a thing. But when I look at the financial pressures that the government say they're under, and I look at the plans for, in inverted commas, making savings, I'm struggling to see where the savings are actually coming from in you know, actual, it's going to release some cash kind of way. So I do think at some point some quite difficult decisions are going to have to be taken about. I'm desperately trying not to use that terrible phrase of a bonfire of the Quangos, because we all remember that. And in actual fact, it never happened, and there's more of them than ever. But I do think there is something, if we're saying that we need to actually save some money, then at some point that's going to have to look at the organisational landscape in the public sector, I think. And very briefly, Lynn, I think it was from VNA, yes, we should catch up if we haven't got up already. So we have a programme of work. One of our main work streams in the Promise Scotland is all about design. We've been doing design schools. Design thinking is right through the heart of the work that we're doing. both with the care experience community, with staff that work in and around care, and we are hoping and planning to get what we call the Pinky Promise Design School up and running, which will be one for very small children. So we should chat. Thank you.
So we've got time for another round, I think. So there's one just in the middle table here and one behind.
Right, thank you. Matthew Creighton here from Friends of the Earth Scotland. I think I want to make a bridge between what Mark asked about and the discussion which has happened so far, which is really about public service reform, I think, was the basic topic we were hearing about. And I just want to try and get into this very quickly by talking about just transition and the idea of just transition plans for every sector and every region of the economy which the Scottish Government is going to roll out. And the question I'm going to ask about is the role of the private sector, not the public. Essentially, surely we won't have a well-being economy unless we tie the private sector into all those objectives which we have, and unless we stop markets doing things which are causing the problems. So my question is, two parts of the question. Through what mechanisms can we ensure that the private sector plays its part in our broad public objectives, which we have a right to have delivered on? And secondly, more generally, does this mean that a well-being economy has to be a much more democratically managed economy, one might say a more socialised economy? Thank you.
Thank you. I think there was another hand. Oh, it's just one at the front here. Yes, thanks.
Thank you. Jamie Livingston from Oxfam. We are 2 or 3 weeks away from the Scottish budget. This afternoon I'm going to be meeting with the Deputy First Minister. He's wanting to talk to the social sector around their priorities. We've talked a lot today around the need to shift spend from sticking plasters to upstream. We know that's very difficult. So my question is quite straight. What does the panel think I should be asking from the Deputy First Minister in his budget in 3 weeks' time, at a point where we're being told that the UK faces the highest tax, quote-unquote, burden since World War II? Thank you.
Thanks, Jamie. Well, that feels like a good ending question for a panel before everyone gets to go to their next coffee break. So I'm going to start at the end. I'm going to invite Jim, if you'd like to comment first maybe on the first question, but then keep the microphone and give Jamie some advice for his conversation with the Deputy First Minister, and then we'll come along the line to everybody else for the same.
Thank you. So Matthew, on your question, I'm far from expert on the best ways to incentivise, cajole and regulate, because I think it'll take all those things. Business, long-term, permanently into this space we're talking about today. But we do have a Scottish National Investment Bank that ought to be accountable, it ought to be transparent, and it ought to be very decisive about how it deploys and attracts resources into the kind of shifts we're talking about today. I think a good example is who will own the means of energy production in this decade and beyond. Satwat, you said, no point, I'm paraphrasing, no point in shifting from a carbon energy economy to a renewable energy economy if we do nothing about the means of ownership. And that has to mean we are radically decentralising. We are enabling communities to own assets in ways that we are seeing glimpses of. I think we're in the foothills in terms of the model we see about wind farm production, revenues flowing through community development trusts in remote and rural Scotland. I was at, Rachel is here from Foundation Scotland. I was at their brilliant event a couple of weeks ago that had some great examples of this happening. But we have to do that all over the country and at scale. And so there are tests we can set. We've got Carnegie's wellbeing tests. We need some wellbeing economy tests. And I think energy, transport, housing, job market, there are the credit market. There are lots of examples where we can think through an alternative approach which will blend all of our assets more effectively in the service of people and planet. On your question, Jamie, about public debt, there are probably 100 answers. One I will pick, one part of this is, because it is within our gift to sort this, and it's the role of public debt on households. Stop doing harm in the way that we chase rent arrears, council tax debt, and other forms of public sector debt. We are doing harm on top of all the flames that are there in people's lives already, when we could be finding a humane alternative approach. And if we find better ways to intervene and stop debt becoming catastrophic debt, we will have found new points of intervention that ought to be opportunities to do income maximisation, make sure people are taking up everything they're entitled to, but also being really clear that will only get us so far. So we heard at the ACF conference last week, Sarah, from the money advice sector, about 45% of households turning to that sector for support have negative household budgets. No amount of income maximisation and debt reduction is going to get their heads above water. So the DFM and his colleagues need to understand with great clarity we're in new territory, and we need to do more than more money for the advice sector, for example. We have to move upstream and understand some of these root causes, make sure take-up of the Scottish Child Payment is automated, for example, rather than being another new claim, and have very generous passporting once people have one touch point in the system. Stop passing folks from pillar to post to tell the story again and again, be assessed and referred, and find much easier, quicker routes for people to access all the support they need to get through the current crisis.
Thanks. On you go. Message to the DFM.
Can you hear me? Oh yeah, I can echo away. I think one of the things, Jamie, I would say, if I was at that meeting, was don't take away from some of the more longer-term preventative funding that you had, for example, associated with whatever the latest child poverty development plans called, delivery plans called, to put into the crisis now, because it sort of feels like we are doing this emergency budget review to support how we can help those most deeply affected by the cost crisis we have at the moment, by taking away money that's there for more preventative work for those most deeply affected by the cost crisis. So that would be the one thing I would say. And the second thing is, don't stop investing in social infrastructure. I think that's critical. It's easier to do away with lots of those non-statutory bits, but actually that's what's going to get people through what we're going into over the next, I would say, 5 years. So in a way, it's about supporting and strengthening the social infrastructure at this time that we need to be thinking about. In relation to Matthew's question about how can we ensure the private sector plays its part, I think everything Jim said was right about needing to work on different levels, but it's also about having the conversations about what that part is that we want them to play, so it's not just continuing to do what they're doing in the way that they are. And one of the conversations we had at a Just Transition meeting was, can the private sector hold more of the risk for certain things? Like, for example, offshore wind at the moment, whereas sort of onshore wind is fairly well established now. So the thing there would be, how do we transfer that into community ownership where we can, and make it assets for the local communities there, but also ensuring that we're not passing on costs to those who are having the most difficulty paying the costs that we've got at the moment. So there's, as Jim said, incentivising, controlling, regulating. I'd say there's a bit of supporting there as well, and looking at their role in risk, and also looking to see how we move to something which then gets shared, as opposed to something which becomes another means of profit for the shareholders.
Thank you so much. And then finally, Fraser, briefly if you can, your one message for the Deputy First Minister via Jamie.
So we, as Fiona said, the £500 million Whole Family Wellbeing Fund is genuinely, potentially transformational for a lot of this stuff. The commitment's made, the commitment continues to be made, and you know, the work behind the scenes is happening to figure out exactly where that money's coming from, Jimmy. So again, I mean, I know DFM is really committed to that, but every opportunity we get for a wee reminder is always very welcome. Thank you.
So Jamie, I hope you've got a good long time in the DFM's diary this afternoon. I'm conscious of time, and we've actually sneaked slightly over, so I'm going to end it there. I'm going to thank all my colleagues on the panel so much for their reflections. Thank again Fiona for opening this session, and I'm going to hand you over to Jimmy, who's going to take us into our last brief session before we have coffee. Thanks very much.